You're tuned into a fresh new edition of Climate Clock. On the show, we discuss everything climate change, sustainability, and green energy. Last month, Washington Post put out a report which suggested that while India is seeing a big push towards renewable energy and solar power, the maintenance of the microgrids has been a big issue for the country, and this could be a dampener as well. Is this the case? How's the execution on ground, and what is the outlook on renewable power execution? We have with us Ashvin Dayal, Senior Vice President at the Rockefeller Foundation, where he leads the Power and Climate Program. He's joining us now on the show. Ashvin, thank you so much for taking our time and speaking to CNBC-TV18 on the show. Well, that's the first question. The Washington Post reported that India is pushing for expansion into solar energy. However, the country is not able to maintain the grids. Is this true? Is the execution been as bad as reported in the Washington Post article?
No, not at all. And I think the unfortunate way in which that particular story was laid out was that it was actually talking about a previous generation of fully subsidized mini grids that the government in the early 2010-12 period had invested in, but there were real problems with those systems because there was no follow-up operation maintenance plan around those. Now, what happened was in 2017, this government launched the Saubhagya program, which was an unprecedented wave of expansion of the grid into remote areas, into villages that were previously unelectrified. And so the reality is that many of those installations from the previous effort were made redundant. But I think what was missed in that article was that there is a second wave of privately led mini grid installations across the country that are augmenting what the grid is delivering. You have a range of really, really innovative companies that we've been working with, from Tata Power to Husk Power to OMC, that have been innovating sort of new business models that are bringing solar energy with battery storage and other technologies and really targeting the supply of reliable, clean energy to what remain underserved communities. So while the grid has expanded very impressively, there is still a need in some locations to augment and improve the quality of power, provide more targeted power to small and micro enterprises. And there are over 1,000 such mini grids operating very successfully. There have been no sort of cases where those have just been abandoned or left aside. And I think that nuance was what was missing in that story.
You spoke about a lot of things, the new scheme coming in 2017 and increasing public-private partnership. What are Rockefeller's plans when it comes to funding the solar power expansion in the rural areas in the country?
Yeah, so absolutely. And, we have been investing heavily in the area of clean energy in India and in other countries. In India specifically, while we have been talking about the mini grids, there is actually a range of other projects and technologies that are really important, that are part of the government's priority. If you think about solarizing agriculture, for example, and the Kusum scheme, how can we support that effort to really scale up? The whole area of rooftop solar, the government itself has set, I think, a 40 gigawatt target to bring rooftop solar into rural areas. It's been very successful with CNI in urban areas with commercial industrial, but we have much more work to do to get it out into areas where the average installation size is much smaller. So we have been working in collaboration with government partners, for example, in Maharashtra and UP and Bihar, as well as with the private sector, to look at ways in which philanthropic capital can help stimulate the market, bring in a level of de-risking that's necessary, because sometimes these are less well-developed areas that perhaps are not as commercially ready for some of these investments as you might see in other parts of the country. In terms of our investment plans, we are part of what we're doing in India as part of a global effort. We put together $1.5 billion philanthropic fund with the IKEA Foundation and the Bezos Earth Fund, which we launched at COP26. And, India will be a very significant portion of that. Look, at the end of the day, philanthropy can play a role in trying to build public-private partnerships and trying to promote the market and achieve a level of scale through commercial investments. So it is always going to be part of a more integrated package of support where we try and work with other partners, both public and private, and use that precious grant capital in ways that unlock the market and hopefully crowd in a lot of private sector investment over time.
Okay, those are some interesting points, but I wanted your opinion. Are there some challenges with respect to installation of solar grids in rural areas? Is it different from the way we do it in urban areas?
I think probably there are a couple of areas. The government has done a lot on the policy side, right? So we now have a lot of, I would say, supportive regulatory conditions for small developers to come into rural areas, to look at rooftop, to look at mini grids, etc. So that's actually been quite a positive development. But it's often the ground realities that are quite hard. If you think about what I said earlier, uh, you know, rural customers are lower, they have lower demand, they are smaller ticket sizes. And so it's getting the sort of financing as well as the developer community comfortable with engaging in rural areas. If you think about things like credit scores, credit worthiness, how do you assess a micro enterprise customer's ability to pay over time for the asset that's installed on their business? So the question of aggregation and helping build visibility over the rural market is probably the biggest challenge when you think about distributed renewable energy projects in a place like India. But we're overcoming that. We're starting to see a lot of innovation by companies that understand that market, that are bringing new types of financing arrangements in play to make it easier for a small customer to purchase this kind of equipment, even if it's an individual installation. And so, we're very, very optimistic. And I think the government's role in providing the regulatory framework for that and providing the political support around through some of its big programs like the Kusum scheme, for example, on solarizing agriculture, are really important sort of force multipliers for what the private sector can then do.
But Ashwin, it's not just creating the asset, right? It's also looking at the entire life cycle of the asset. Does the business model pay over the life of the equipment sooner than later?
Yeah, it's a tough market. And when I mentioned some of those companies earlier, like OMC and Huspa, they're the ones who are really putting skin in the game in terms of commercial investment. OMC, Omnigrid Micropower Corporation, for example, over the last 2 years has attracted over $100 million of equity financing from international partners. So there is a belief that there is a return to be made in these kinds of investments if they get the right kind of support. So we're actually seeing now the commercialization of this sector, not just in India, but globally, as something that is going to happen at a much, much more accelerated scale over the next 5 years. It's not, like I said, it's not an easy market. It's taken a while to evolve and mature. And that's a lot of where we come in as a philanthropy, providing some of that ground support, some of that additional technical assistance to companies that are trying to get into this space. But when we talk about the life cycle or the return rates, it depends what kind of asset we're talking about. It's very different for a rooftop installation that maybe you have a 2 or 3 or 4 year payback period versus a large mini grid that's serving an entire community of, say, 200, 300 connections, which may have a 7 to 10 year payback period. But at the end of the day, if commercial investors are coming in and putting real money into the sector, then to me, that's a sign that there is a real commercial viability to this at the end of the day. And that's what's probably most encouraging.
We are getting closer to COP28. What, according to you, should be some of the top priorities in that case?
I think there are two big priorities that we have to deal with at COP28. The first is, while we are all extremely optimistic and bullish about renewables, we have to deal with the question of intermittency or variability. The sun doesn't shine at night, the wind doesn't blow sometimes. And so a real challenge for governments who are very committed to the energy transition is, what do I do about my base load? How do I bring in alternative base loads that can help me expand renewable deployment over the next 10 years, 15 years? And we don't have all of those solutions on the level of financing and political support needed. Just to give one example, the incredible role that battery energy storage is going to play over the next 10, 15 years. We have to have something coming out of COP that can really turbocharge the availability of supply chains on battery storage, the technical support that's needed for them to be integrated into the grid. So that's one area that I think COP can make a big difference on, is dealing with the baseload question and looking at battery energy storage as a real opportunity for the future. There are incredible new chemistries emerging on that. The other is building on what we were talking about earlier. Distributed renewable electrification is going to be the primary solution for hundreds of millions of people, especially in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And that is going to require concerted political and financial effort not just from the likes of the Rockefeller Foundation and the Global Energy Alliance, but from governments, from multilateral development banks, and very importantly, from the private sector. You see large companies now looking at this sector, getting interested in it, and we have to create some incentives at COP to really encourage them to jump in to the sector and create the opportunity that will lift hundreds of millions of people over the next decade.
Ashwin, thank you so much for joining us, setting this record clear with respect to the Washington Post report, and also telling us what the execution is looking like on the ground and Rockefeller's plans as well when it comes to funding such projects in India and globally. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Lovely to talk to you. Thank you.
And with that, we'll take your leave on this edition of Climate Clock. Stay tuned for more updates.